The Whitmore family went to bed healthy on October 15th, 1839. By dawn, 3 were dead, 2 were dying, and only little Sarah remained conscious enough to whisper the name that would haunt Alabama forever: Martha Greer. The maid they trusted with their lives had been slowly killing them for months. But what happened next proved that some betrayals run deeper than murder, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. The town of Huntsville, Alabama, had never seen anything like the Whitmore estate. Built in 1835 by cotton merchant William Whitmore, the 3-story mansion stood like a monument to prosperity in the heart of the Tennessee Valley. William had married Elizabeth Patterson 2 years earlier, and together they were raising Elizabeth's daughter Sarah from her first marriage, along with William's elderly parents who lived in the East Wing. By 1839, the household employed 6 servants, but none were more trusted than Martha Greer. At 28, Martha had worked for wealthy families across the South for over a decade. She spoke softly, moved quietly through the house, and seemed to anticipate the family's needs before they even knew them. Elizabeth Whitmore often told her friends that Martha was a godsend. Martha prepared every meal, served every cup of tea, and maintained the medicine cabinet with precision. The Whitmores never questioned her methods because they never had reason to. That trust would cost them everything. The first signs appeared in late August. William began experiencing stomach pains that came and went without warning. His mother, Agnes, started having dizzy spells that left her bedridden for hours. Elizabeth complained of constant nausea, and even 10-year-old Sarah seemed listless and pale. Only William's father, Thomas, remained unaffected, spending most of his time in town on business. Dr. Harrison, the family physician, visited twice in September. He prescribed tonics and rest, attributing the symptoms to the late summer heat and perhaps contaminated well water. He suggested the family boil all drinking water and avoid heavy meals. Martha nodded respectfully and assured him she would follow his instructions precisely. But Martha had her own instructions to follow. The poison she chose was arsenic, readily available at any general store as rat poison. Mixed properly, it was nearly tasteless and caused symptoms that doctors often mistook for common illnesses. Martha had learned this technique years earlier, though from whom she never revealed. She began with small amounts in the morning coffee, just enough to cause mild discomfort. Then she increased the doses gradually, watching as the family grew weaker. She adjusted portions based on each person's size and constitution. William, being the largest, received the heaviest doses. Little Sarah got the least, but enough to ensure she would eventually succumb with the others. The genius of Martha's plan lay in her patience and her performance. As the family's health declined, she appeared increasingly concerned. She suggested remedies, prepared special meals for the sick, and even volunteered to sit with family members during their worst episodes. When Elizabeth was too weak to manage the household, Martha stepped in seamlessly, taking control of everything from meal planning to correspondence. She was positioning herself perfectly for what came next. If you're finding this story as chilling as I am, make sure to subscribe, because we have many more dark tales from America's past that will keep you awake at night. By early October, the family was barely functional. William could hardly manage his business affairs. Elizabeth spent entire days in bed. Agnes required help with basic tasks, and Sarah's schooling had stopped entirely. Only Thomas remained healthy, but his frequent trips to town meant he rarely witnessed the full extent of his family's suffering. Martha began dropping hints to neighbors about the family's financial troubles. She mentioned unpaid debts, failed investments, and William's increasing desperation. None of this was true, but Martha was creating a narrative that would serve her later. She forged letters in William's handwriting, making it appear he was borrowing money from distant relatives and selling property secretly. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Once the family died, Martha would claim they had signed over certain valuables to her as payment for devoted service during their illness. She had already hidden jewelry, silver, and even some of William's business documents in her room. To anyone investigating, it would appear that a financially ruined family had died of illness, and their faithful servant had been partially compensated for her loyalty. But Martha made one critical error. She underestimated Thomas Whitmore. On October 10th, Thomas returned early from a business trip to find his entire family bedridden. Something about the scene struck him as wrong. His wife Agnes, who had always been robust despite her age, looked gray and skeletal. William, normally strong enough to wrestle bulls, could barely lift his head. The smell in the house bothered him too, a strange metallic odor he couldn't identify. That evening, Thomas prepared his own meal using ingredients he purchased in town. He also prepared water from a different well on the property, one that Martha typically avoided. He felt fine. Meanwhile, the rest of his family grew worse after their dinner, which Martha had prepared as usual. Thomas began watching Martha closely. He noticed how she always prepared the family's food separately from the servants' meals. He saw how she controlled access to the medicine cabinet and insisted on personally administering all remedies. Most disturbing, he observed how Martha's concern seemed rehearsed, as if she were playing a role. On October 14th, Thomas confronted Martha directly. He demanded to know what she was putting in the family's food. Martha's response was perfect calm. She suggested that Thomas was under stress from his family's illness and wasn't thinking clearly. She reminded him that she had served the family faithfully for over 2 years and had no reason to harm anyone. But Thomas had already made his decision. That night, he planned to stay awake and watch Martha's activities. He never got the chance. Martha realized that Thomas was growing suspicious, and she couldn't afford to let him interfere. That evening, she prepared his favorite drink, whiskey with honey and herbs, and delivered it to his study personally. She told him it would help him sleep better so he could be strong for his family. Thomas drank it gladly. The dose Martha gave Thomas was massive compared to what she had been giving the others. She needed him unconscious quickly before he could raise any alarms. By midnight, Thomas was in agony. By 2 a.m, he was dead. Martha had crossed a line she hadn't intended to cross. Thomas wasn't supposed to die that night. Her careful timeline was ruined. Now she had to accelerate everything. She spent the pre-dawn hours preparing final doses for the rest of the family. Large amounts in their morning tea, their breakfast, even in the water she used to give them their daily medicines. She told herself it was merciful. They were suffering, and this would end their pain quickly. But as the sun rose on October 15th, Martha discovered that murder is never as simple as it seems. William died first, around 5 a.m. Agnes followed an hour later. Elizabeth lasted until nearly 8 o'clock, though she was unconscious for her final hours. Martha had expected Sarah to die with the others, but the child's smaller doses over time had built up a tolerance. Sarah was sick, desperately sick, but she was conscious, and Sarah had seen Martha preparing the morning tea. When Dr. Harrison arrived that morning, summoned by a frantic Martha who claimed to have discovered the family in distress, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 4 family members dead, 1 child barely alive, and a servant who seemed surprisingly composed for someone who had just lost her entire household. Sarah whispered Martha's name when the doctor leaned close to examine her. She was too weak to say more, but she managed to point toward the kitchen where Martha was preparing what she claimed would be healing broth for the child's recovery. Dr. Harrison had seen arsenic poisoning before. The symptoms, the rapid decline, the way the deaths had clustered together, it all pointed to one conclusion. He quietly asked Martha to step outside while he examined Sarah more thoroughly. Instead, Martha ran. She made it 3 miles before the sheriff's men caught up with her. In her haste to escape, she had left behind the evidence that would seal her fate. Hidden in her room, they found the remaining arsenic, jewelry belonging to Elizabeth Whitmore, forged documents, and most damning of all, a detailed journal describing each family member's reactions to different doses of poison. Martha had been keeping notes like a scientist conducting experiments. The trial began in November 1839 and lasted just 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming, and Martha's only defense was to claim that she had been trying to help the family by giving them medicine that she thought would cure their illness. She maintained that she had purchased rat poison to use as a pesticide and had somehow confused it with legitimate medicine. No one believed her. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Martha Greer was sentenced to death by hanging, making her the first woman executed in Alabama for mass murder. But her story didn't end with her execution. Sarah Whitmore survived, though she never fully recovered. She lived with relatives in Tennessee and rarely spoke about the months she spent slowly dying at Martha's hands. When she did mention that time, she always insisted that Martha had spoken to someone else in the house, someone Sarah never saw but could sometimes hear whispering in the walls. The Whitmore estate was sold after the trial, but it never stayed occupied for long. New owners reported strange occurrences: food that spoiled instantly, water that tasted metallic no matter how many times the pipes were changed, and the persistent smell of bitter almonds that seemed to seep from the kitchen walls. But the most disturbing reports came from the servants' quarters, specifically Martha's former room. People claimed to hear scratching sounds, as if someone were writing constantly. When they investigated, they found nothing, but the sounds continued night after night. In 1847, the house was converted into a boarding house. The owner, Mrs. Catherine Mills, decided to renovate Martha's old room completely. When workers removed the floorboards, they discovered something that had been hidden for 8 years. Carved into the wooden subfloor, in handwriting that matched Martha's journal, were hundreds of names. Men, women, children, all carved with meticulous care. Some names were scratched out, others were circled, and a few had dates beside them that stretched back over 15 years. The Whitmore family names were there, along with their death dates, but they weren't Martha's first victims. They weren't even close to being her first victims. Mrs. Mills tried to have the floor replaced, but the new boards would warp and split within days, revealing the carved names underneath. Eventually, she gave up and simply covered the area with a thick rug. But servants refused to enter the room, claiming they could feel someone watching them, someone who was still making plans. The boarding house closed in 1852 after a series of unexplained illnesses among the residents. The building stood empty for decades, slowly decaying while the town tried to forget what had happened there. In 1889, exactly 50 years after the murders, the house was finally demolished. Workers who tore down Martha's room reported that the carved names had somehow spread to the walls, the ceiling, even the window frames. Names of people from towns across Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee. Names that suggested Martha Greer's poisoning spree had lasted much longer and claimed far more victims than anyone had ever suspected. The lot where the house stood remained empty until 1923, when a small grocery store was built there. The store's owner, Henry Walsh, noticed that certain foods would spoil faster than others, particularly items containing ingredients that could mask the taste of poison: coffee, tea, honey, and anything with a strong flavor. Henry also noticed that customers would sometimes mention feeling unwell after purchasing these items, though they never connected their symptoms to his store. Henry began paying attention to patterns, keeping notes about which products seemed cursed and which customers reported problems. What he discovered terrified him. The spoiled foods always appeared in a specific section of the store, the area that corresponded exactly to where Martha's room had been located in the original house. More disturbing, Henry realized that the customers who reported illness were always people who reminded him of the Whitmore family, prosperous, trusting, and kind to their servants. Henry Walsh closed his store in 1925 and moved to California. He left behind a letter explaining his decision, which the local newspaper chose never to publish. In that letter, Henry claimed that Martha Greer was still working, still planning, still choosing victims from beyond the grave. The lot stands empty today, though the city has tried multiple times to develop it. Every attempt fails for different reasons: financial problems, construction accidents, or permit issues that drag on for years. Local residents have given up trying to explain it, but sometimes, particularly in October, people walking past the empty lot report catching a faint scent of bitter almonds carried on the evening breeze. And sometimes, just sometimes, they hear what sounds like scratching, as if someone hidden underground is still carving names and making plans. Sarah Whitmore died in 1891. taking with her the full truth about those final months in the Whitmore house. Her last words, according to her caretaker, were a warning. "She's not finished. She'll never be finished." The question that haunts Huntsville to this day isn't just how many people Martha Greer killed during her lifetime. It's whether death has actually stopped her from killing at all. Because if you believe the reports from that empty lot, if you trust the patterns that Henry Walsh documented, if you listen to the stories that families across Alabama still whisper about unexplained illnesses and faithful servants who know just a little too much about medicine, then Martha Greer's work continues, and her next victim might be closer than you think.